There are people who never leave your mind. They become ghosts that follow you through silent days and restless nights. Gabriel knew that presence well. Anna was no longer there, and yet she had never really left. She was the first thought upon waking and the last when trying to sleep. Even on the busiest days, her name would appear, like a notification from his subconscious. He had already deleted the photos. He had blocked and unblocked her number at least 5 times. He tried the no-contact method. He tried keeping his mind occupied with work, with the gym, with friends who repeated the same phrases. "Move on, man." She already did. But Gabriel couldn't. There was something in him that always pulled him back to that face, that laugh, that specific way she crossed her legs when she was nervous. Every detail was a hook lodged in his memory. But what truly suffocated him wasn't nostalgia, it was obsession. It was no longer love. It was a prison, and that obsession, Gabriel didn't yet realize, had nothing to do with Anna. Because behind her image, there was something much older, deeper, and far more terrifying, a part of Gabriel that he had forgotten. Gabriel sat in his small apartment, under dim light, staring at his phone screen. Anna's name was still saved in his contacts, alongside an old, pixelated photo taken on an ordinary day that now seemed sacred. He pressed the button to delete it, then canceled. Pressed it again. Canceled again. The cycle of an obsessed mind. Gabriel was not a man without awareness. He had been to therapy, had read about toxic attachments, had learned in theory that some people are not meant to stay forever. But there was something irrational, an underground force pushing him back into that abyss. And within that abyss, Anna was not just a woman, she was a symbol. A screen onto which Gabriel projected everything he lacked inside. He didn't know it. But Anna was not just Anna. She was the unconscious promise of filling a void that had existed long before she was even born. In the days following the breakup, Gabriel tried to rationalize. He made mental lists of her flaws, tried to remember the fights, the days he felt invisible by her side. But none of that erased her presence within him, because Gabriel wasn't just dealing with a loss. He was being forced to confront an absence that had existed long before their first kiss. Anna had only turned on the light in that dark room. An old house, full of closed doors. Each relationship opens a door. But when the person leaves, the door doesn't close. It stays ajar. And inside, there is something much older than the relationship itself. Gabriel was about to discover what lay behind the door Anna had left open. And that discovery would change everything. Not all love is about love. Some are reunions with parts of yourself that you spent a lifetime trying to forget. Gabriel tried to fill the void with movement. Dating apps had become a daily distraction. He swiped through the screen like someone searching for an emergency exit. Names, faces, shallow conversations. He arranged dates with women he could barely remember the next day. His body was present, but his mind still lived in Anna. He started training twice a day. He ran until his legs burned, lifted weights as if he could bury the pain beneath bars of iron. The physical exhaustion was temporary relief, but the silence after the workout always brought Anna back. She appeared in his memory like a song he hadn't chosen to play. And the nights? Alcohol and forced laughter with friends who, deep down, didn't know what to say. "You need another woman," they'd say, raising their glasses filled with empty answers. He tried to laugh along with them. But every new woman was just a frame without an image. An empty outline. None of them were Anna. And that was the problem. Until one of those nights he ran into Lucas. Lucas wasn't just an old friend. He was almost an observer, the kind of person who looks beyond what you say and, from time to time, says something that lingers for weeks. "What's up, man? How are you?" Lucas asked. The automatic response came out. "I'm getting by. It's rough, but I'm managing." Lucas didn't reply right away. He just looked, with that gaze that doesn't buy into prepackaged answers. And then, almost as if speaking to his own glass, he murmured, "You think you miss her, but are you sure you know who you really miss?" The words fell like a stone into a still lake. Gabriel pretended not to understand. He let out a forced laugh, changed the subject. But the stone had already sunk, and the ripples had begun. On the way home, Gabriel's mind kept circling that question, who do I really miss? The discomfort was physical, as if the question were digging a new hole inside him. Or perhaps reopening an old one. In the days that followed, that phrase wouldn't leave him. Gabriel started noticing something strange. In every woman he tried to meet, he was looking for something specific, a way of laughing, a way of looking, a likeness that only existed in Aina. But was it really Aina? Or had he always been searching for something, even before her? With Lucas's words echoing in his mind, Gabriel started rereading his old messages with Aina. He wasn't looking for happy memories. He was looking for clues, traces of who he was when he was with her. And what he found scared him. He realized that every time Aina made him feel special, alive, complete, it wasn't really her creating that. It was him. It was as if she had been a mirror, reflecting parts of himself, parts he had never learned to carry alone. When Aina left, she took those pieces with her. Or maybe Gabriel only thought they belonged to her. And now, every new woman was an attempt to reclaim those parts, but they were his. They had always been his. The other, the beloved, is not just a person. They are an altar where we place pieces of our own being. When that person leaves, it's not just them who disappears. They take with them everything we projected onto them, our hopes, our dreams, our vulnerabilities, and our deepest desires. The pain of loss is not just nostalgia. It's the despair of having lost a part of ourselves, or of never having known it outside of that reflection. Gabriel didn't know it yet, but he was starting to feel it. Aina was not the source of his pain, she was his mirror. And to reclaim what he had lost, he would have to look beyond Aina. He would have to look within. Gabriel's nights began to be dominated by a strange repetition. He would wake up sweating, with a tight chest, his mind confused. Dreams pursued him, and at the center of them all, there was always Aina. But in his dreams, Aina never spoke. She didn't touch him, didn't hug him, didn't love him. She only pointed toward a locked door. Every night was the same. Gabriel tried to approach the door, but when he reached out his hand, something paralyzed him. An invisible force that prevented him from acting. He felt the heat of fear growing in his chest, but the door remained there, unyielding, like a challenge thrown by his own unconscious. He would wake up, sweating, with his face pressed against the pillow. The silence in the room was deep, but the feeling of helplessness persisted. The fear wasn't just about opening the door. The fear was about discovering what was behind it. Aina, in his dreams, was no longer a loving or desired figure. She was no longer the woman he missed. She was a symbol. Something in Gabriel, something very old, wanted to be seen, but he didn't know what. And the fear of opening that door, of confronting what was inside, was overwhelming. The first morning after one of those dreams, Gabriel felt different. A new discomfort emerged within him. Something unsettled him, but he didn't know what. He had gotten rid of so many things, yet he felt he hadn't moved a single step forward. Aina's reflection in his mind began to blur, distort, and at the same time, became more present. Gabriel knew something was out of place. But he also knew that the key to solving it all seemed to lie in that locked door. He just didn't know how to open it. The metaphor of the door was clear, though he wasn't yet aware of it. The door represented his unconscious. What he feared most. What he most needed to look at, but what he also avoided the most. And Aina, in his dreams, was the trigger. The person who had unleashed the search for the door, for the hidden truth. But Gabriel wasn't chasing Aina. He was actually chasing something deeper, something he had ignored for years. Something he feared to see, feel, and confront. In his mind, Aina was the perfect mirror. She reflected his emotional deficiencies, his abandonment traumas. She wasn't to blame. She never was. She had only temporarily carried Gabriel's wounds, and he had mistaken them for love. The obsession wasn't with Aina, but with what she represented, a projection of his deepest insecurities. Gabriel began to realize that the obsession wasn't with Aina. She was the manifestation of something he didn't want to see. Emotional emptiness, the lack of validation, the insecurity of not being enough. He remembered Lucas's words, those words he still didn't fully understand, but that now resonated. Louder. You think you miss her, but are you sure you know who you really miss? The question became clearer. Gabriel missed the image of himself that Aina had represented. He missed the part of himself that was absent and that he desperately sought in another person. Then, he remembered something he had read in a psychology book, something he had never paid much attention to. A quote by Carl Jung that now seemed to fit perfectly. We fall in love with who carries our lost soul. That was it. He wasn't in love with Aina. He was in love with the image he had projected onto her, with the part of himself that he had lost and was trying to find in her. Aina was the reflection of his deepest wounds, his deficiencies, his fears, and his abandonment traumas. He didn't love her. He used her as a mirror to fill his inner void. Gabriel saw himself in a dream again. But now, instead of seeing Aina pointing at the door, he saw her from a distance, behind a window. She watched him, but without saying anything. The window was between them, as if what he was searching for was inside him. But he needed to break the internal barrier to see it clearly. What Gabriel really needed, he thought, was no longer Aina. He needed himself. He needed to look inward, to find what was buried behind that closed door. But the fear of facing what he had always avoided was overwhelming. He knew that the only way forward was to confront what was hidden inside him. Gabriel was starting to understand the true meaning of obsession. It wasn't about someone else. It was about himself, and that, in some way, was even more terrifying. Gabriel didn't know what he expected to find when he entered the room where Lucas was waiting for him again. But he knew that something deep was about to happen. He was already beginning to understand vaguely that his obsession with Aina wasn't about her, it was about him. But what exactly did that mean? Lucas watched Gabriel as he sat on the couch with a tired expression. There was no rush in his words anymore, as if time itself was starting to stretch within him. Your obsession is your shadow screaming, Lucas said calmly. The phrase wasn't explanatory. It wasn't simple, but it fell on Gabriel like cold rain. The shadow. Gabriel had never heard of it before. He had never heard anyone talk about the hidden side of oneself, as if it were something real. He didn't understand it immediately, but he felt at that moment that those words were important. Lucas continued, as if he knew Gabriel would need time to assimilate it. The shadow is everything you've rejected or hidden from yourself. It's your fears, your insecurities, your vulnerabilities. It's the fragments of yourself that you don't want to see. And you projected them onto Aina. She was the reflection of what you couldn't accept in yourself. Gabriel stayed silent. The idea of a shadow was strange, but it made sense in a bewildering way. He had felt something similar before, but had never named it. Lucas handed him a notebook. That simple gesture was like a key. Review your memories, Gabriel. Remember what you've always left behind, what you've always tried to hide. The shadow doesn't disappear. It only waits for you to look at it. Gabriel didn't have to search much to find what Lucas was suggesting. Memories flooded him powerfully, like a movie he didn't want to watch but could no longer avoid. First, his mother. He remembered her as a distant figure, like a cloud floating over his childhood. She was always there, but never present. He tried to get closer to her, but with every step, she moved farther away. There was never a comforting hug. There were never words of affection. Just an absent look and a cold calm. And then, his father, critical, always critical. Nothing Gabriel did was enough. Never, he remembered. The disapproving looks, the words that hurt more than any blow. His father was there, physically, but never emotionally. He never saw Gabriel as a whole being, worthy of love. The validation Gabriel sought so much was there in them, but it never came. It was invisible to his parents. And somehow he carried that invisibility into his relationships. Gabriel began to understand the pattern. All the women he had loved, or thought he loved, were emotionally inaccessible. They were never fully there. They were, in some way, distant, unattainable. They unknowingly created an endless dance of pursuit and rejection. Gabriel fell in love with these women as an unconscious way of healing his first wound, that of his own parents. Each woman was an attempt to restore what he had never received at home: love, presence, acceptance. But that cycle was flawed. He could never fill the void with another person, because the root of it all was inside him. He had projected that search onto others, believing someone would save him. But in reality, he was just searching for the lost pieces of his own identity. Gabriel still didn't know it, but he was finally beginning to understand the nature of his obsession. That obsession wasn't about Anna. She was just the mirror where he saw his own shadow. He was in love with the idea of love, with the promise of something that had never been given to him, with the search for something he thought others could fill, but no one could. Gabriel began to see, in fragmented pieces, the parts of his shadow. He felt a sharp pang of pain as he remembered his childhood and his relentless search for validation. But at the same time, a new perception was beginning to emerge in him. He could finally see the connections between his relationship patterns and his unhealed wounds. But this revelation didn't come in a clear and gentle way. It was like a crash, a sharp, constant pain. That night, Gabriel had a dream. In the dream, he was once again standing in front of the closed door. But now, the door was no longer just pointed to Anna. It opened, though only for a brief moment. Gabriel felt the impulse to step through it, but the light coming from it blinded him. And as he looked inside, he saw the reflection of a child. A 7-year-old Gabriel with tear-filled eyes. But before he could do anything, the door slammed shut. He woke up, feeling his heart race. That childish reflection wouldn't leave him. It was him. It was who he had been. The child who never received the love he so desperately needed. The reflection he had avoided seeing his entire life. Gabriel knew that the door could no longer be ignored. He would have to face it. He would have to look at his shadow, the parts of himself he had spent his whole life rejecting. Only then could he begin to heal the wound he had mistaken for lost love. He didn't know if he was ready, but he knew he could no longer turn back. Gabriel sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the wall. The soft morning light filtered through the window, but he saw nothing but his turbulent mind. That morning brought with it a painful revelation, a truth he feared more than anything else. He was no longer running from it. The truth had become impossible to ignore. "I never loved Anna." The words came slowly, as if they had been pulled from the deepest part of his being. The idea was simple but devastating. He didn't love Anna. He had never truly loved her. What he really loved was the idealized version of her, a version created from his own absences, from the unfilled voids in his soul. He loved the image he had projected onto her, the expectation of something that never existed, but that he needed to exist to fill the void that had always chased him. He remembered what Lucas had told him, those words about the shadow and projection. Gabriel had projected his emotional needs, his shortcomings, his unmet expectations, and his desires onto Anna. She was no longer a real person, but a screen onto which he projected all his fantasies, everything he wished she could be, but never could. Gabriel finally understood. Aina was the personification of the love he had never given himself. The idea of love he so desperately needed, but could never find within himself. He had sought in Aina what he couldn't give himself: validation, acceptance, love. Lucas, in one of their previous conversations, had mentioned something that Gabriel hadn't fully understood at the time. Your obsession is your anima screaming. Now he recalled those words, and suddenly, everything made sense. The anima, in Jungian terms, was the feminine archetype within Gabriel, the part of himself he hadn't integrated. By projecting Aina as an idealized figure, Gabriel had created an image of the feminine that reflected his own desires, but also his own limitations. She was the personification of his anima, but an unrecognizable anima, filled with expectations and unattainable perfection. He had placed all his emotional shortcomings, his impossible expectations, onto Aina. She was no longer a human being but an ideal. And the moment he idealized Aina, he trapped her in a box of illusions and at the same time chained himself to the idea of a love that could never exist. Gabriel's internal confrontation was immediate. He saw himself sitting at the edge of the bed, his eyes filled with tears and his fists clenched. The pain was unbearable, but it was a necessary pain, the pain of awakening. "I never loved you, Aina," he murmured, as if he was finally speaking the truth. But the pain grew. He didn't know what to do with that truth. "I loved the version of me I saw in your eyes." Gabriel no longer knew if he was speaking to Aina or to himself. The image of Aina disappeared, giving way to his own reflection, returning his own gaze. He loved what she represented to him, the love he believed she could give him. But it wasn't about her. It was about him. Suddenly, he saw what he never wanted to see. He was trapped in an illusion he had created himself. And the prison was made of unrealistic expectations and shortcomings he had never wanted to face. He had loved the idea of love, not real love. The emotional collapse hit hard. Gabriel stood up from the bed, his body trembling with rage and pain. The tears came uncontrollably, tears that were more than just loss. They were anger toward himself, anger at the illusion he had created and nurtured for so long. He slammed his hand against the wall, powerless. How could he have been so blind? How could he have spent so much time idealizing something that never existed? How could he have denied himself what he needed most? He tried to deny the truth, to push it away, but it was impossible. The crack in the illusion had already been made, and there was no way back. But deep down, something inside him knew that now that the truth had been exposed, he could finally begin to rebuild himself. Although the pain was intense, it was also liberating. He no longer lived in a world of lies. For the first time, he was facing the reality of his own life. He didn't need Aina to complete his story. He only needed himself. The revelation had been harsh, but now he knew that freedom lay in the truth, not in the illusion. Freedom lay in accepting his own vulnerabilities, in seeing the parts of himself he had always tried to hide. Gabriel understood that real love wasn't about projecting onto the other what he couldn't give himself, but about accepting and loving himself fully. Deep down, he knew that this liberation wouldn't be easy. There was much to process, many layers to unravel. But the journey had only just begun, and now Gabriel knew he was closer to finding himself than ever before. Gabriel felt a constant pressure on his chest, as if the weight of the world was concentrated there, waiting for the right moment to crush him. But instead of running away, he decided to face the pain head-on. He knew he could no longer postpone what he needed to do. The truth would no longer be ignored. He was ready for the journey. Not a physical journey, but the psychological journey that would lead him to confront his own soul. Gabriel began to revisit each scene, each memory, but this time he wasn't feeding nostalgia. He was trying to see clearly what he had been projecting onto Aina at every moment of their relationship. He remembered the conversations, the shared glances, the silences filled with unspoken expectations. He remembered how he had always tried to make her the answer to all his questions, the cure for all his wounds. But now he knew every moment with Aina had actually been an attempt to fill a void that only he could heal. He had sought in Aina what he had never given himself: full acceptance, validation, unconditional love. And when the relationship ended, the void expanded, leaving him in pieces. The anguish of not having given himself what he had sought in others turned into a desperate need to heal the wound. But how? How could he heal something so deep, so ingrained? The answer came unexpectedly. One quiet afternoon, Gabriel sat at his desk and began to write. At first, he didn't know what to write, but the words flowed effortlessly, as if something inside him knew exactly what he needed to say. Unsent letters. He wrote to Aina, but deep down, he knew those letters were for himself. He wrote about the love he didn't know how to give himself. He wrote about the abandonment he felt for not being able to fill his own void. He wrote about the years in which he believed he would only have value if someone loved him, if someone validated him. With each word written, Gabriel felt a lightness emerging. He wasn't asking Aina for forgiveness, but himself. He was forgiving himself for abandoning himself for so long, for believing his happiness depended on something external. For the first time, he was telling himself that he was enough. He no longer needed another person to complete him. He no longer needed a woman to give meaning to his life. That night, Gabriel had a dream. But it wasn't a dream like the others. It was different. It was the final confrontation. He found himself once again in front of the closed door. But this time he knew what to do. He walked through the door, determined. Inside, he found himself younger, with the eyes of a lost child. And in his hands, he held an empty frame. The reflection of adult Gabriel appeared before him. But it wasn't just a reflection. He saw the child with a sad expression, holding the frame as if waiting for something that had never come. But then, adult Gabriel stepped forward. He carefully took the empty frame from the child's hands and placed his own reflection inside it. For the first time, he saw himself as whole. There was no longer a need to fill the void with another person. He had found the missing piece within himself. That moment of connection with his inner child gave him the courage to take the final step. The Gabriel who needed Aina to exist died there, in that instant. He no longer needed an external relationship to validate who he was. He no longer needed to project his need to be loved onto someone else. He finally understood. True love begins from within, not from outside. The version of Gabriel who was always looking for something to fill his void, who saw love as an external quest, died there, in that room, that night. The new Gabriel, stronger, more whole, more aware of his own essence, was born. And that birth wasn't easy. He felt the pain of a psychological death, but he also felt the relief of liberation. Gabriel woke up that morning as someone who had been reborn. The pain hadn't disappeared completely, but now he knew how to manage it. He knew that his void wasn't something that could be filled by another person, but something he had to learn to embrace and understand. He knew that the search for love would no longer be an escape, but a journey of self-knowledge, a path of inner healing. He smiled in front of the mirror. Not a smile of perfection, but a smile of acceptance. He knew the path would still be long, but he finally understood that he was no longer alone. Gabriel looked toward the future with a sense of peace, knowing that the only person he needed at that moment was himself. The death of the person he had been made way for a new beginning. He had overcome the illusion. Now he could live the truth. The morning light gently entered through the window, and Gabriel found himself standing, looking at the city, which now seemed new. He breathed deeply, as if the air had a different taste. It was as though, somehow, he had awoken from a long sleep and was now seeing the world with new eyes. He couldn't exactly say when the change had begun, but he knew it had happened. And most importantly, he He knew it was real. Aina was no longer a villain. She was no longer a muse. She was no longer the absence he had once believed her to be. Now, she occupied another place in his mind, a place of learning, a teacher. There was no anger, no regret. What he had once seen as a loss was now becoming a lesson. He had finally understood that Aina was the figure who, in some way, challenged him to look deeply at himself, to see parts of himself that he had never wanted to see. He smiled to himself. A calm smile, without resentment. She, in some way, had been the key for him to get here. She had made it possible for him to descend into the depths of his own unconscious, to understand his shortcomings, and to project his fears onto her, only to then free himself. She had never been the cause of his pain, but rather the mirror that reflected everything he had not yet learned to see within himself. Now, Gabriel was back on his path, but with a new perspective. He understood that he should never again lose himself in another person, as he had with Aina. He needed, finally, to find himself. Not to depend on someone else to feel complete. Not to seek in another what he had to find within himself. Gabriel knew that the love he sought was not outside of him. It was inside. He was ready to love in a new, conscious way. The shadow, his shadow which he had once avoided, was now part of his life. Gabriel had learned to integrate his fragilities, his fears, and his shortcomings. He no longer pushed them away from himself or projected them onto others. He accepted them, looked at them with compassion, because now he knew his fragilities were part of his humanity. They were not weaknesses but lessons, each one with something important to teach him. The integration of the shadow did not mean perfection, but acceptance. Gabriel no longer saw himself as someone broken who needed to be fixed, but as someone in constant reconstruction. He was a work in progress. And for him, that was liberating. He understood once and for all that we can only truly love when we no longer need the other to complete us. True love is not a quest, not filling a void, but a choice. Loving someone not out of need, but out of a deep connection with who we are. He now knew that healthy love comes from inner wholeness, from the ability to be happy with oneself before being happy with someone else. The next day, Gabriel found himself in an art gallery, a random exhibition he had decided to visit without high expectations. But as he walked through the halls, something peculiar began to happen. He stopped in front of a painting. It was a self-portrait, painted in soft light tones and deep shadows. But it wasn't just any self-portrait. It was him, but in various phases of his life. A young Gabriel with a sweet, innocent gaze. A teenage Gabriel with a face filled with anguish and doubt. An adult Gabriel with a broken heart, carrying the scars of all his past relationships. And finally, a reconstructed Gabriel, still marked, but now with the strength of someone who had overcome their own pain. Each face was a version of himself, but also a lesson learned, a battle won. Gabriel looked at those paintings with a melancholic smile, but one filled with understanding. He saw his entire journey reflected there, in every brushstroke. Each face in the painting represented a step in his transformation. The child who never felt truly loved. The teenager who desperately sought acceptance. The broken man who tried to fill the void with other people. And the man who now stood before a new possibility. The man in reconstruction, with the freedom to love and accept himself. As he walked through the gallery, Gabriel felt a peace he never imagined he would experience. He no longer ran from who he was, nor did he hide from his shadows. He embraced them. He had understood that by integrating his shadow, he had gained a silent strength, a quiet wisdom that would guide him in the next steps of his life. He was no longer afraid of being imperfect. He was no longer afraid of being in process. He was no longer afraid of being alone. Because now he knew that loneliness was not a punishment, but an invitation to meet the most authentic version of himself. At the end of the gallery, Gabriel stopped. He looked at the last painting, the self-portrait of the reconstructed man, with a simple, elegant frame, but full of meaning. He realized that there was no longer any pain, only gratitude. He silently thanked Aina and all those who had crossed his path, because in the end, they had all been part of the process. They had helped him get here. Gabriel knew that there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, he was ready to walk alone, with courage and without fear. The path of reconstruction is never linear, but he was willing to walk every step with acceptance and compassion for himself. He turned around and walked out of the gallery, feeling freer than ever. Life was in front of him, open, without the ties of the past, and deep inside he knew that finally, the man he had always wanted to be was there, whole, reconstructed, and ready to live. Gabriel stopped in front of an open window, the gentle wind caressing his face, bringing a sense of renewal. The sun was setting, coloring the sky with golden and orange hues. He felt that, although the journey of self-discovery had been arduous and filled with shadows, it had led him to a place of peace and clarity. He looked at the horizon and realized that, through this entire process, he had not only learned about himself, but also about the workings of human relationships. Something in his life had changed forever. He no longer viewed the world in the same way, no longer with eyes of need or lack. Now he saw people with a new perspective. They were mirrors, reflections of everything he had yet to recognize in himself. Who is the person who never leaves your mind? The question resonated in his mind. He already knew the answer, and more importantly, he knew what that person represented. It was not Aina, it was not anyone in particular. It was himself, the person he had avoided for so long. He looked inward and for the first time saw himself fully. He realized that, for years, he had projected his shortcomings and desires onto external people, without noticing that everything he was looking for was already within him. Who is the person who never leaves your mind? And if that person is just the reflection of what you have yet to see in yourself? He smiled, as if he had finally understood a universal truth. Every face that had tormented him, every lost love, were merely parts of his own quest for wholeness. Accepting the idea, Gabriel returned to the moments he had lived, to the people he had loved and those he still cared for. But now he saw something more. He saw the lessons, the masks he had projected, the expectations he had never questioned. He remembered all the times he had seen himself reflected in someone else's gaze, as if that gaze defined him, when in reality, the only gaze he needed was his own. How many loves have you lived or lost, without realizing that each of them was a reflection of the relationship you have with yourself? He thought about this as he walked toward the center of his living room. On the wall in front of him was a mirror, the same one he had avoided at other times. The same mirror that had once terrified him to face. Today, however, he approached it with curiosity, and as he looked into his reflection, he saw someone new. Someone whole. Someone who no longer depended on the approval of others to feel complete. Gabriel was now able to look at himself without hatred, without frustration, but with love and acceptance. Carl Jung said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves." Gabriel had never understood that until this moment. He understood that his obsession with Aina wasn't about her, but about everything he had projected onto her: the search for validation, the fear of abandonment, the desire to be loved. Aina was nothing more than the reflection of what he didn't want to face in himself. The same happens with those we love, he reflected. When we fall in love, we don't see the other person as they really are, but as the reflection of our own deficiencies and desires. Realizing this, Gabriel was finally able to free himself from the illusion and attachment, understanding that true love starts within us, not outside. Now, Gabriel was ready to leave the past behind. He no longer carried the weight of pain or expectations. He was free. The search for someone or something to complete him no longer made sense. He knew that the only person he needed to find was himself. And when he finally found himself, he saw how much he was capable of loving, not from lack, but from an inexhaustible source of acceptance and self-knowledge. Maybe it's not about forgetting someone. Maybe it's about finally remembering yourself. That phrase echoed in his mind, like a distant but clear sound, remembering yourself. That was it. He didn't need to forget Anna, nor all the other people who had been part of his life. What he needed was to remember who he truly was, without masks, without projections. Just him, whole and now, as the wind continued to blow and the sunlight began to fade into the horizon. Gabriel wondered, once again, if the truth had always been there, waiting for him. The truth about him, about love, about others. Perhaps the only necessary step was to look inward, to accept the shadows and the lights, and then, finally, to live without the need to be someone or to find something outside of oneself. Gabriel was at peace. He no longer needed to search. And you, dear viewer, how many loves and stories have you lived without realizing that, deep down, you were looking for the missing piece within yourself? How many times have you seen yourself reflected in another, without understanding that this reflection is actually the image of who you truly are? Sometimes, the journey isn't about finding happiness outside of us. It's about remembering who we are at our core, and from there, learning to love ourselves. Without waiting for someone else to do it for us. The mirror is in front of you. What do you see in it?